Welcome to the One Inside, an internal family systems podcast. I'm your host, Tammy Sallenberger. On today's podcast, I talk with Tanner Wallace about trauma healing. Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. I'm super excited to talk to Tanner today. Tanner is an IFS trained practitioner who is at the helm of the survivor led trauma recovery revolution. She guides adults with complex trauma on relationship healing journeys so that they can claim everything they lost along the way. This episode is amazing for many reasons, but what I especially love about it is I think it's going to be really helpful for people new to the IFS model and for people who get overwhelmed and flooded when they go inside their own systems. Tanner offers practical, helpful tips about working with your system, and she just has such a gentle, loving, and warm way about her. You can check out her website, relationalhealinglab.com. You can find all things about her there, including her podcast. You can also follow her on Instagram at Dr. Tanner Wallace. Tanner and I are actually going to do an Instagram live on Saturday, May 6, 2022. So the day after this is released, we're going to do an Instagram live. So if you're listening to this in real time, definitely hop on Instagram at 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. To connect with me, you can follow me at IFS Tammy on Instagram, Twitter, and at the One Inside Facebook page. You can get a free Get to Know a Should part and sign up for my sometimes monthly newsletter at tammysallenberger.com. You can also buy my book, The One Inside 30 Days to Your Authentic Self, wherever you buy books. Enjoy. I always like to start with just kind of letting everybody know where you are in the world. So if you were to look out so tell everybody where you are in the world. And
Yep.
if you were to look out your nearest window, what would you see?
Yes. So I am located in a little village outside of Pittsburgh, PA. It's called Swickley. And when I look out my window, which is literally like 2 feet from where I'm recording, first I notice the wavy glass because my house is an 1894 house. And so Pittsburgh was actually a major glass blowing hub in that time. And I've watched this really cool video at our history center where they used to blow the glass circular and then heat it again and let it go flat and then ship it. And that's why you have wavy glass, is because it was originally blown in cylinders and then flattened. And so they're not at all energy efficient, but something about the beauty of the view just being a little bit distorted in some historical way, I find very, I don't know, very tender to me. So that's what I see. And then I have a flat roof outside, and it's called Tinner's Red. It's a red paint that they used to use a long time ago, and it is very peeling. It is, as the home inspection report said, at the end of its life expectancy, and we have not dealt with that. I got some estimates, and I was like, "Holy, that's how much you like." I feel like we could slap some paint on there. Which we have not, which is also part of my busy life. And then on the other side of the roof, of the porch roof, I see the yellow of the forsythia bush, which has just bloomed in the last few days here. We've had some warm weather. So, and then down my street, I see a bunch of houses and everyone has porches and it's a walking community. So I like my little village.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. Do you know the historical story of your home?
So there is a book of houses in Swickley, and our house is actually in it. It doesn't say too much about it, but they like list the architect and who originally had it built. But what's most kind of noteworthy about my street in the village is that it was all orchard at some point, and then there's a house kind of 2 blocks down that's a little bit bigger than all the other houses, and that was the original house, and they just had orchards all throughout this land that house is built. But yeah.
I
Yep.
love that. And so I want to talk about relational healing and what that
Yep.
means.
Yep.
And I want to talk about the 5 circuits of healing I want to talk about that.
Yeah.
And you have a heart and a passion for healing trauma. And
Yeah.
it sounds like you're using IFS for doing that. So I
Yeah.
definitely want to spend some time talking about that.
Yeah.
And then we can talk about whatever else comes to mind as we chat. How does
Yeah.
that sound?
That sounds perfect. And if I had my preference, I'd start with the trauma and the IFS because I actually am so curious about what you think about some things.
Perfect.
So
Yes.
I feel like we could have a really good conversation about just complex trauma, IFS, trauma recovery, using a parts perspective. I have so much to talk about and just think about and wonder about with that.
That sounds great. Let's do it. Where should we begin?
Oh my gosh. We should begin with, yeah, where should we begin? I mean, do you know my story of how I ended up in the IFS community? That's where we should begin.
I love
Yeah,
that.
because it's a very
Yes.
unlikely and recent. So unlikely and recent. So I feel like that might be a good place to
I
start.
love it.
So
Yeah, let's do
yeah.
that.
So I, up until the end of this past August, 2021, was a university professor that taught human development for a while. Let's say I was a researcher, taught human development, studied classroom interactions and psychological safety. And when COVID hit, I'd been kind of for a few years feeling like there was something more, like there's something more. I love my research, but I don't know. I love teaching, but it's feeling just I feel I'm being called to something more. And then COVID hit and my research came to a screeching halt because it was all classroom based. And, I was kind of thinking, what should I do? Like, what could I add to the mix that would feel kind of very aligned with what I already do, but something very different? And so I thought about doing a podcast. I was like, oh, I'll do a podcast. I interview people all the time for research, love talking about things. And personally, I just struggled so much in my marriages, which is plural. So I had a first marriage that ended in, well, the separation went on for a little bit, but officially ended in 2015. And that was just a really complicated, confusing relationship for me. And, met a new person, fell in love, was like, oh, all my problems are solved. This is going to be great. New partner, new life. And it wasn't, right? And from a parts perspective, totally makes sense. But I didn't know about parts at the time. Just was feeling like, oh my gosh, how could my second marriage just still be having the same issues? And there was one moment kind of in the before the podcast where I was standing in my kitchen, my partner and I, my second husband and I were having a fight. And he literally said to me verbatim something my first partner had said about how I am in relationships. And I remember pausing. It was one of the most humbling moments of my life. I was like, oh my gosh, like, how can this be? Like, these two people that have known me really well, very different humans, are saying the exact same thing about me. So that kind of planted a seed of, I teach this, I talk about relationships, I talk about psychological safety, but there's something that I'm not downloading. There's something about the way I show up in relationships that intellectually is not translating from all these things. I can stand on a lecture stage and have a good talk about all these things, but in my personal life, man, it's just not quite doing it. So I thought, okay, I'll talk about a podcast. And actually, the first branding of the podcast was Marriage is Hard. And the first season was about 10 episodes, and I was still very much in my professor comfort zone. Then somewhere after 10 episodes, I started feeling like I just want to talk more openly. I'm tired of doing the research recap. I just want to talk. And I just want to talk to people about relationships. Got on Instagram and wasn't ever on social media before, except very informally, and Facebook. Was on Instagram, starting to look for people. And I started interviewing people. And one of the people that somehow the algorithm bumped into my little feed was Justin Martin, who I know you've interviewed. And so I started reading Justin Martin's stuff. And I thought to myself, well, this is could you curse on your podcast?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So I thought to myself, this is some crazy fucking shit that this guy is talking about. What the fuck is he talking about? I don't even understand this. I'm like, I have to have him on.
Hmm.
So the first time I had Justin Martin on, I think it was September of 2020. The whole when I listen back to that episode, the whole podcast is me trying to process literally what is he saying? So I'm trying to give it concrete examples of what I know about DBT.
Yeah.
Well, is it like this? He's like, well, no, it's not really like that. I'm like, okay, it's not like that. So is it like, and so I give a mindfulness example. No, it's not really like that. So literally the whole podcast, I'm trying to figure out what this is that he's talking about. What, because it just was so different than anything I ever heard of anyone ever explained to me. So the interview ends. I think to myself, I didn't give a very good interview there because I think I was getting, I don't know, I didn't really, it wasn't sinking in. Okay, so fast forward 2 months, and my partner and I had a really bad fight, and we had like a conversation about it. And I was laying in bed, and he had fallen asleep, and I was just laying there. And I knew enough about like trauma, and I know what emotional flashback is. So I just knew I was having this full body panic that something was really wrong, even though my partner's right there, and even though I don't know if relationship wise we'll be okay, but I know I'll be okay. But my body was telling me a very different story, my
Mm.
brain. So I went downstairs, and I was sitting on my couch at 2 a.m. and just feeling so awful. And oh, what did Justin say? What did he say you do? And he's like, well, you just kind of check in, like, who's there? What's here for me? So I closed my eyes, and I remember thinking at the time, you've really gotten desperate, Tanner. Like if you're doing this at 2 a.m., you've healed enough not to reach for a drink or like a vape. Like, I mean, you're doing okay by yourself, mama, but like now you're turning to talk to yourself. But I just did it. I was so desperate. I was so desperate, and I'd gotten fairly sober. So I was like, I'm not going to go that route. But what's in, and I just could not believe what transpired when I dropped inward. It was, all these parts with all these different stories saying all these different things. And it was probably only like 30 seconds. And then I bounced right out of it. And I couldn't even really process what had happened, but I knew that something had happened. So I had Justin back on. We talked about it a little bit more. And then I started seeing actually him. I started seeing him out because he was going through training. And so I was like, actually, will you see me? Because I think I want to explore this. So we met a few times, and as he was going through his level 1 training, and I can't tell you how much it transformed my life. I just, it took everything that it almost makes me emotional. Like there's an emotional piece coming up now that is very self-energetic emotion,
Mhm.
just this deep knowing of something to be true, that for my whole life, nothing ever made sense. Nothing made sense. I couldn't ever have this pattern to my behavior that I could look at and be like, oh, that makes sense. I'm not crazy. This just makes sense. And when you're a trauma survivor, it's really extreme, some of this stuff. It's not just little things. It's a big thing. So you don't make sense on some big grand scope and scheme of things. And that's really a very scary, isolating experience. And I finally started making sense. Everything started making sense. And
Mm.
it was so humanizing and so transformative to me that I just knew I was like, I need training in this. I need to understand this more. And so I submitted for a level 1 training, and I don't know how the universe just made it all happen because I got in on the first. I'm like, oh, this is craziness. I got in on the first try. So I actually completed my level 1, graduated in November, and have been seeing clients since, building a community around. I mean, I was talking IFS, but not practicing it, obviously, until I had my own training. But I hit the ground running as soon as they're like, you can start meeting with clients. I'm like, I'm in. I'm like, who's meeting with me? And I've been guiding and running group programs. And I think there's so much to say, so I don't want to keep just making this a monologue. But just one other thing I'll add, and then I'd love for you to jump in, is that the beauty of the work I've been doing in a survivors community has been to weave in other modalities and other experiences that kind of fast track some of the unburdening. So not to shortchange it, because it's a process and it has its own aligned timing. But there's actually some things you can do to kind of grease the wheels. I gotta say, that's a weird, I've never said that out loud before, but like for some reason that's just coming to me right now, to kind of get the system going to help protective parts trust, because that's one of the huge things I've learned in complex trauma is that the protective parts, whew, they're a force to be reckoned with. So I've learned kind of by my own kind of ground up work some intuitive strategies for working with them. So all that's to say, that's how it all starts for me. And really my deepest passion now is just to continue to build knowledge around complex trauma in IFS. There's so few frameworks. I mean, thank goodness that Frank Anderson's like kind of anchoring that movement down. And there's so much more that I've even witnessed in my short time with my own system and other people's systems that are trauma survivors that are really important, that never show up in a demo, never show up, in a lot of the training, but I just learning. And one other piece I'll share. Actually, I'll just end there. But I did end up getting a demo in my IFS training. That's an interesting story with Madeline Warren. So I'll just put that out there if we want to come back to it. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to come back to what you're talking about when you're talking about greasing the wheel, because I think people that are listening to this want to know, so they
Yeah.
have some things they can take to their own therapy, or as
Yeah.
therapists they can help their clients with. So I would love to talk about, what you mean by that.
Yeah.
And then I think I want to back you up though. I appreciate you sharing your story
Yeah.
so much. I know it's a privilege to hear people's stories, so I'm so
Yeah.
thankful for that. I think what I really want to hear is about, what was it about IFS that you were like, I'm now understood in a way that I haven't been my whole life as a trauma survivor. Something about IFS, I'm understood. Tell me
Yeah.
about that.
So I think it just, when you have a complicated system that has been developing over so many years and has so many different survival codes where you've literally lived a childhood and adolescence always tapped into where's the danger? Where do I avoid the danger? You're just so keyed into a fear-based frequency, and that happens at so many different levels. As a childhood trauma survivor, there's the meta level where you're socialized into frameworks and the way the world works through a acculturation process from your family that just lives in a fear-based paradigm. And then it happens behaviorally as you're trying to navigate interpersonal interactions that aren't safe, right? And so there's so many different survival codes, and they're all very distinct and feel incomprehensible because they're incoherent, because they're not coherent, because it's you didn't develop a set of neural networks that just tightly cohere into like this is how it all works together, and this is how the world works. There are these seemingly one-off networks of things that don't even make sense. Why do I rage so suddenly in this, and then someone can disrespect me so profoundly, and I'm just don't even notice it. Like it just rolls off my shoulder, and then when I think about it, I'm like, wow, that they didn't treated very well. How can I at once be so driven to be on a stage with 3,000 people with this national grant, and then I look at my closest relationships and no one has any ambition at all. These things that just, when you zoom out, why does my life make no sense? None of my choices line up to,
Mm,
and then you're hearing people talk about the choices they've made, and you look at the choices you've made, and there's no rhyme or reason. You're like a plastic bag that's been floating in the wind.
mm,
When I started to meet all my parts, I was like, oh, that's my performance part. I get it. And my performance part is connected to a dark part, and the dark part clears the way. So the performance part isn't, hindered. But then I also have this likability part that's always trying to avoid humiliation. I could just map out, and it felt in my body too. Why do I feel this way? And I think, I share openly about this, but at some point I was given a borderline personality disorder label. And there were times in my life where I know the thoughts I had about other people. And I would think to myself, I don't know where these thoughts come from. They're so dark and they're so vicious, and they feel so disconnected to what I feel I am inside. And yet I'm having these thoughts. I say these things. It does feel like I don't have empathy sometimes. That makes me feel awful as a human. And now I just understand that was my dark part. And my dark part was just doing a job it thought it had to clear the way for the performance part, which is how I survived my childhood. So I'm like, oh, okay, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not an evil, awful person. So
Yeah.
I think that's why, and just interacting with people with, bipolar disorders and anxiety disorders and depressive disorders and, you know, all these different disorders, I'm doing quotes
Yeah.
for the listening. It's not disordered at all. It's fucking brilliant.
Yeah, exactly.
It
Yeah.
might not be so good in the real world. And it might not lead to health and well-being, but it's not disordered at all. In fact,
Yeah.
it leads to what appears from the outside to be disordered and disorganized. But when you step inside and you learn why and how and under what conditions and for what reasons, it makes complete sense. And I actually just recently on my own Instagram bio, just in all caps, put "you make sense." Because I just was like, I just want to say
Yeah, I
it.
love that. I love that. And I love the idea that it's actually brilliant, right? It's
Yeah,
parts of us are actually brilliant. Like your dark part was brilliant in the way it helped you back then.
yeah,
Like in the way it
yeah,
helped you, it needed to help you to function and to survive. And it's
yeah,
brilliant in its role.
yeah. I think the other way it made me feel like I make sense is that I feel like you can hear, neuroscientists talk about this. If you just Google on YouTube, they'll say things like, well, if you're a trauma survivor, you're looping back through old experiences, right? It's like you're time traveling. And intellectually that, kind of made sense to me. I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm looping back through. But when you sit with a part that literally is frozen in time and you're seeing them as a trauma survivor where they were or what they've actually witnessed over the years, and you can give that shape and form and emotion and sit with that, it gives it kind of an embodied feeling of, oh, like this is what terror feels like. And these parts are still reliving this terror. It's why it's not so easy. It's why this affirmation isn't working. It's why this mindset thing I keep listening to on the app just is not working, Like it's just not gonna work for these parts.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. It's hilarious. But yeah, I love that. Tell me about this, if this feels okay to talk
Yeah,
about, because I've had this conversation with a couple people about how different IFS is in how we heal trauma by being with the part who's feeling terror, so that
yeah,
I'm not then re-terrorizing myself. Like I'm not having a
yeah,
50-minute therapy session where I am re-terrorizing myself and then I have to go back to work or go back into my relationship. It's
yeah.
IFS is different that way because I am then with the part who's experiencing terror. So I guess I want you, can you talk about that a little bit, sort of what your experience has been like and
Yeah,
how that's different than
yeah,
typical trauma
yeah.
modalities?
So I would say the biggest thing that I've noticed, which is, you know, really noteworthy, is that I feel like a lot of trauma modalities don't honor protective parts, right? So ones that are more implicit memory based, they just blow past protective parts and don't do any, is this okay? What do we need to do to have those parts feel this is safe or comfortable? So they just get blown past. And so often survivors will have horrible backlash from, firefighter parts because they weren't, like, it was just too much, too fast, too quick.
Yeah.
Um, but also too, traditional talk therapy, I think, engages self-like managers. So you could sit through, I told my story, and probably not thousands, it feels like thousands of times. And I had no connection to it. I could just rattle off all these events,
Mm,
but they had no connection to really what was it like to be in my body and my brain and my mind. It was this narrator, this, I could go back and say all the things. So I think it's those two things really make IFS very different,
mm,
in that you do work with protective parts. So you're getting to understand and respect their role. And for trauma, their role has been critical. And so just working with protective parts is a huge part of IFS with trauma. But I also think, too, my experience has been that one of the things that I think the IFS community perhaps could, I mean, I'm such a baby, so I want to be careful what I say. Like, probably, there's probably other people talking about, I feel like a grad student who's just started, and I'm like, more people need to talk about this. And your advisor's like, actually, I wrote a book on it. And you're like, oh, damn. I
whoops.
didn't know. Oops. So let me have a caveat to be like, I'm very new to this community. But one of the things, and if there are people doing this work, I'd love to be connected, that I think the self-energetic role of the guide, we focus a lot on compassion, which makes sense, right? You need to be compassionate, and there's almost never too much compassion you can give to a system. And for a complex trauma survivor, courage is,
Mm,
if not more important, when you're guiding. Because what happens is, in a lot of non-IFS based situations therapeutically, is a protective part will just come out, right? Like, you're not getting close to this. We see what you're up to. And in everyday human interaction, people move away from those parts or try to control those parts. And then you're the part, it's like it's like, okay, we've thwarted this, no one got deeper, or it creates this weird relational bump in the therapeutic alliance and it never really recovered. It gets all off energetically. And so, to go back to what you said, I think what's different is it's not re-traumatizing, because one of the most profound things I have done and been able to do as a guide is to teach people how to stay in body and present with a part that is really big energy. And me just being like, I'm here, you're here, we're with it. This part is not alone. Just keep saying, I'm with you, you're not alone. I'm with you, you're not alone. And in some of my sessions, it's literally 30 minutes of a survivor just learning to stay with that physiological sensation that that part is flooding, noticing when dissociative parts come in, noticing when shut down parts come in, and narrating that for me as the guide. So I'm aware of it, or just naming it themselves. I'm starting to feel like I'm losing the edge of the feeling. Okay, let's work with that. Can it soften? And the biggest success I ever have, the biggest level up, is when a survivor can sit with that big energy of a protective part, stay with it. And so this, I'm excited to talk technical. As a guide, no blockout or blank out or dissociative or distraction part has come in when it's not a sudden shift out of the physiological sensation. So when it's like abrupt, you're like, oh, damn, another part came in. Shoot, we didn't last the whole time. But when it just fades and you kind of see their self energy come back, you see their face sort of soften, you're like, oh, we did it. We stayed with it the whole time. And that's such a trust building experience in someone's inner world when no one's been able to sit with that before. And you can do that a few times with protective parts, and they start trusting you more. They start trusting your client more, the self energy of the session, of how this works. And then, and this is like like an add on to this. Another thing I don't think we talk about enough, at least my exposure and training, is what I've seen is you do that a few times in sessions and you're successful. And what happens is, I've seen it 3 times. It's happened to me as well, is that a protective part will start trusting enough and they just soften back and they soften back. And then what they'll do is they'll give you the biggest, scariest body memory you could ever imagine. And it happens. And the person will say to me, my client will say to me, and you can see it on their face, and it's just pure terror. It's like it's terror. And they're like, I'm somewhere, and it's really scary, and I don't know, and but I don't recognize it. I don't know where I am. In all cases, including my own, I didn't recognize it. Wasn't a memory I knew of, and it's super sinister. And all people, and this was my experience too, will be like, I feel like I'm in a horror movie. It feels like a horror movie, and when you stay with it and self energy and you just coach them through, just stay with it. Just there's a part that's terrified. They're alone right now. They need you to stay with this. Keep moving closer to whatever. And they're like, I don't know if I can. I just keep opening your heart. Just see if you can stay with this. And if you can stay with that, it's from there, this incredible cascade of unburdening. It's almost like protective parts and complex trauma systems have these tests. Like, okay, you're here. You want to see it? You want to see it? And they slow, and it's so fascinating. And then when you get to the ultimate body memory test, if you can succeed that as a guide and with your client, you're like, woo, we did it, we stayed with it. And this whole new softening of the entire system happens. But they're terrifying. I mean, craziness, so much so that when I had my experience, I was still kind of blended with it, and I didn't want to hang up with my therapist. I was like, there's a part of me that doesn't want to hang up with you, right? Like, I'm scared to hang up with you right now. Yeah, they're intense, but that's so, I think it's not re-traumatizing, to go back to what you asked, because you're showing the survivor you can stay with this. You're building trust with these protective parts. They're starting to understand that self energy is real. It can be depended on. It's a resource for the whole system. And it's not, you got all this stuff activated with no understanding of how to access self energy, and then you're just pushed back into the world with no resource. And I think one of the biggest disservices we do to survivors is we tell them that the resource is outside of themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what was coming up for me, was that, self isn't terror. Self isn't feeling terror. And
Mm-hmm.
so it sounds like the more the system trusts that self isn't terrorized, and the
Yeah.
protector, sort of that big energy scary protector, is
Yeah.
learning that self isn't going to go away. Self is right
Yeah.
here, and you're saying, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, I'm not
Yeah.
going away, I'm right here. Even
Yeah.
the scariest thing, I'm still right here, I'm still
Yeah.
courageous, I'm still calm, I'm still compassionate. And then the whole system almost, it sounds like, you're not saying it this way, but sort of the whole
Yeah.
system sort of reorganizes around this trusting of this
Yeah.
internal resource, which is ourselves, which is our
Yeah.
authentic
Well,
self.
it gives you access to wounded younger parts. So until you pass that test, they're like, hell
Yes.
no, you're not going
You're
near
not touching
these.
them. Of course not. Of course not. Right. So that's what I'm totally getting from you, is that,
Yeah.
right. So then once you sort of pass that test,
Yeah.
then the protector says, okay, I'm going to trust you to
Mm-hmm.
invite you into these younger wounded parts so that you can unburden them and get
Yeah.
them out of their, terrorized
Yeah.
places that they're stuck in.
Yeah, exactly.
I
Yeah,
love that.
exactly. Yeah.
I love that. And I love the idea too that other therapies have said, okay, this is, the big protectors who are like, okay, well, we'll leave you alone, or we're going to go do something else. We'll talk about something else, instead of like, I'm just going to stay right here. Like, I'm not scared. I'm not going to go anywhere. I'm just going to stay right
Yeah.
here. And we're going to stay together as long as it takes,
Yeah.
and really building and befriending, and sort of,
Yeah.
the IFS term of really befriending that protector.
I guess one of the pieces that I'm kind of been curious about is that, like, I feel the coverage of self-like parts. I got a training version of it, and then I started connecting some dots. And yeah, I feel like that's a really interesting aspect of IFS work, and it's taken me a little bit to find my way with self-like parts. And I kind of had some theories about self-like parts and trauma, but I'm curious, what you think, and how you think about self-like parts, as an aspect of this work.
Yeah, I guess I mean, I can answer that, but I guess I guess I'm going to put it back on you and
Okay.
say, well, let me just say this. This is
Okay.
this is my quick answer about self-like
Okay.
parts. I feel like when, okay, so if we're working with ourselves, let's say I'm working with my own system. Let's say it that way. I'm
Yeah.
working with my own system, and I'm working with a part that's feeling really sad. And I have a part that's been up lately. This feels really sad,
Hmm.
and I am noticing that I'm kind of curious about it, sort of where I assess for self energy, right? I'm assessing it to
Right.
see. So I'm a little bit curious. I'm a little bit interested. I'm a little bit, there's like a little bit of something. And so two things happen with self-like parts. One is I'm not going to get any information about the sadness. The sadness isn't going to open up to me. I'm not, whether I'm journaling with it, I'm going to get stuck. So if it's a
Yeah.
self-like part that's trying to get to know the sadness, I'm
Mhm.
not going to be able, it's not going to flow like you said. There's not going to be a
Yeah.
flow. There's going to be some stuck happens. So I think that's one of my first clues that I'm in a self-like part is the sadness isn't going to open up to me. The other clue that I think is a really sort of an easy way to assess for self-like parts is when I'm like, okay, I'm feeling some curiosity or a little bit of curiosity, or a little bit of compassion towards the sadness, I might notice where I'm feeling that from in my body. Because
Yeah.
often if I'm feeling it from my head, that I'm feeling is sort of a more intellectual analyzing kind of
Right.
it's gonna knock me out of the feeling, right? So feelings in my system, feelings can be really overwhelming. And so I'll go into thought, I'll go into analyzing. Well, here's why you're
Right.
sad, and here's what you need to do. And it makes sense that you're sad, and da 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 da. Like it
Right.
makes sense that you're sad is a self-like part that I've learned, right? My system is like, I know that I've learned to think about the part in order to kind of help it not overwhelm me. But that's not
Oh,
self, right? That's self-like, sort of a
right.
thinking about that makes sense. Sort of it makes sense. If it makes
Yeah.
sense from my head, that's
Yeah.
self-like. Can it make sense from my heart? That feels
Right.
different in my body. There's more self energy there. It makes sense. Making sense from my heart. Is it a different experience for my whole system?
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I assess for self-like parts. I don't know if that's totally what I don't think it's totally what you're asking, but
Yeah.
um,
Well, I think it connects to, so one of my kind of working theories about self-like parts with trauma survivors is that they feel almost like pseudo parents. They feel like these really old parts that are maybe some of the original parts that join. I know parts are always like, it's supposedly, according to theory, they're with us all, from birth. When trauma doesn't create parts, just the strategies that parts use. But they kind of hopped into action at the first indication that, oh, parents aren't going to be here to do this, or parents are making this worse. And this idea of them being kind of pseudo parents has been kind of meaningful, because I do think, like you said, it's hard to get behind that or above that, because have such a lockdown on how all the other parts work, and they do cut off access to so many different things. They're very challenging to work with.
yeah. Yeah, I think the other thing that just came up for me as you're saying that
Yeah.
is I remember when I first started, I think it was in my level one training actually, and I remember hearing a part say, I am you, but it was like
Yeah.
pissed off. And I thought, well, that's probably not self if you're like, well, I am you and I'm
It seems a
pissed.
little agenda.
Right?
Seems like you have an agenda there.
And so I think what you're saying is I think that makes a lot of sense that there be some parentified, sort of parts.
Yeah.
We think about that with our little parts, right? They've become
Yeah.
parentified little children. But I think you do exactly what you said is you stay with them, right? And if they're
Yeah.
pissed, they're like, I am you and I'm not going anywhere. You're like, okay,
Yeah.
we're just gonna hang out here. This is the part
Yeah.
that has the big energy. So we're gonna hang out here. How do I feel towards you? And I'm just gonna hang out and get to know who you are in my system, what your role is, why you're so important. And I'm going to let you know I think you're a big deal and how much I appreciate you. And we're just going to
Yeah.
hang out.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that I love about IFS is in some ways it's so simple, right? I'm going to do the
Yeah.
exact same thing with that self-like part that I'm going to
Right.
do with the dissociative part, that I'm going to do with the part that says you're not getting anywhere near your trauma. I'm going to do the exact same thing
Yeah.
with all those parts, right?
Yeah.
I'm gonna unblend. I'm gonna make sure that I'm in self. I'm gonna
Yeah.
send my compassion. I'm gonna send my open heart. I'm gonna hang out with you and befriend, and then we're just
Yeah.
gonna see what happens.
Yeah. One of the things that I found that's a little it feels a little unique about these pseudo parent self-like parts that I've seen in people's systems, including my own, is that as the healing process happens, it feels to me that they carry a lot of shame because they start to recognize in this very tender way, oh, like not only did I not protect the wounded younger parts because I couldn't have because I don't have any agency in the real world, and but the strategies I used hurt other parts and made it worse for everyone in the real world. So I found this parallel shame and regret process of these parts that runs really deep with trauma survivors, that is like almost its own unburdening process in and of itself, that you know almost needs to happen before wounded younger parts can be unburdened. And I know that the protective parts won't fully do new roles until the wounded younger parts are unburdened, but I have found that in trauma, unburdening the protective parts and witnessing their shame and regret is a large portion of the process. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's exactly what you were saying at the beginning, was how important it is to work with those protective parts. And I think it
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense. And I've learned this over the years, is that
Yeah.
protective parts can also have burdens. And so
Yeah.
doesn't it make a lot of sense with trauma that the
Yeah.
protective parts also hold some burdens of shame and
Major
regret?
burdens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think it makes so much sense to really slow down and not just sort of, sort of pass them by, ask for space from those parts, but to really recognize that those parts need to be unburdened before we go to
Yeah.
to the exiles.
Yeah.
And I think it's really, I'm loving that you're noticing that there are these different themes, right? That you're
Yeah.
noticing that in your system and the systems of the people you're working with, you're
Yeah.
really noticing these different themes of how their systems, how there's some similarities in all these different systems.
Yeah. Yeah. Shocking similarities, actually, where I just almost can't believe it. Like
Yeah.
the last time I saw, it was a couple weeks ago, another body memory experience. As soon as it started, it made complete sense. It was happening in that session because of the work we'd done in the prior sessions. And as soon as my client said, Tanner, I feel like I could tell terror had entered by the face, but she said, I'm at some playground and it's dark and there's a weird slide and I've never been here before. I was like, I wonder if this is going to play out like the other ones have. And it totally did. So there's some universal themes that I am noticing across these, and definitely the unburdening of like the self-like protective parts is one of them. And interestingly, kind of a sub theme of that is that often when you really get to know kind of what they're afraid of, sort of in the unburdening, like not just what they're afraid of in the real world, but what are they afraid of in terms of the healing process, they will say, I don't want anyone to witness what the wounded younger parts are going to have to unburden because I feel it reflects poorly on my protective role. And that's a big deal. And so I think one of the things, actually, I'm thinking now that you had asked me about earlier, what makes IFS different? It is so humanizing for me to be able to say, you all can have this private experience in your inner world. All you have to tell me is, I've done it, and I will give you prompts to keep the process moving. But please tell this protective part that in the unburdening of that wounded younger part, you do not need to speak a single word out loud to me as your guide. You literally can have this internal experience. And I will say, when that's done, just let me know and I can give you maybe another helpful suggestion on where to go. And it can be a totally private experience. And I think for many of us, there's parts that have never, probably protective parts, never been willing to actually get honest about experiences. And this allows that privacy to do it without compromising the healing,
Mm.
which is huge. I mean, so
Yeah.
big.
Well, and I love that, and without adding shame, right? Because
Yeah,
it makes so much sense that like I didn't do a good enough job, a protector. I didn't do enough good enough job. And so now
yeah,
you're going to witness that, and then you're going to
yeah,
see my shame by that. Like
yeah,
it's,
yeah,
that I love that. I mean, I love that that's something to really be aware of. And it just reminds us how slow we have to go with our protectors.
yeah. Which reminds me of the demo. Let me tell you about the demo.
Okay, tell me.
So, I mean, my level one participation was so shaky because I was so blended with so many parts. I mean, I was one of two other people who weren't therapists, so that alone was very intimidating. Trauma survivor, not having done a lot of the work. I was doing the work as I'm in the training. So it was a little shaky of a participation for me. But I guess kind of the third session, the third intensive week, 4-day session, I was like, okay, I'm gonna put my name in. Oh, because it was Madeline. I don't know if you know Madeline Warren, but she was gonna do the demo. I was like, okay, it's Madeline. I feel like I could do this. And I felt an obligation to survivors everywhere to be like, I want to do a demo because my system's very different than a lot of the systems I'm witnessing here.
Mm.
So I put my number in, and of course, I get it. I'm like, oh gosh, I got it. What are the chances of that? And so Madeline and I had this beautiful, I wish that session had been recorded, and I wish my earliest sessions with Justin had been recorded so people could see where I started.
Mm.
But I wish Madeline's, we had recorded it, because what it was an example of is that when she entered my system, it was so chaotic that we couldn't even begin to work with any individual parts, and it was 70 minutes of her just lending self energy to me to get my parts to spread out and sit down. And what was so powerful about it is that once she got them to spread out and sit down, they never went back to not being spread out and sat down. So that was a huge healing win for me.
Mm.
And it was because she was so courageous with my system and just so direct with all my parts. Um, but it was just a really good example. Every other demo we'd seen, wounded younger parts had been unburdened. It went so quickly. And I know things go faster when you're in a group and there's the I see that in the groups I run. It's amazing what you can do when there are collective witnessing and collective self energy. It's pretty powerful. And even with that, it was this example of, in some systems, just bringing calm and parts, just even being able to sit down or breathe some space without storming or flooding the gates, kind of grabbing on symbolically to self and being like, you're here, help, 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 help. And just, you can't find yourself in the midst of all that energy of all the parts. It was such a beautiful example of that. So I was really privileged and honored to be able to contribute that, because I feel like there needs to be a rounding out of demos.
Yeah. No, and I feel like I hear that from my clients, right? As soon as they go inside, they're like, there's so many parts and they just get flooded, and we're just trying to sort of calm everybody down. So was there
Yeah,
something that she did that really helped, just for the listeners, that maybe that's their experience? They go
yeah,
inside and their parts just want they're finally here, right? You're finally here, and they
yeah,
all want to speak at the same time.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
So it's interesting because I interviewed her for my podcast, and we debriefed this a little bit. And I thought the stuff she said was just stuff she always said because it was so effective with me. And she's like, oh no, I think I just intuitively kind of get a sense of what's happening. And she's like, I don't even know if I've ever said that to anyone, but now that I know that it works, I'll say it to more people. So it was just such a touching, oh my gosh, you're just so good and intuitive and guiding. But I've used what she said in my sessions with other people, and it has worked. So I'll share it here, as there's some efficacy to it through other clinical applications. But she was really focused on, and it's beautiful. I've used this sometimes. So I'll kind of drop into my guide voice, but it's something like, okay, so I would love you just to take a moment right now. I know there's a lot happening right now in your system, just to maybe take a breath, just really inhale. And as you exhale, I want you to imagine breathing space without pushing parts away. So you're just breathing space, but no one's getting pushed away. And just see if you can do that. And so often that is a go-to of mine. I also have another one, and this is from Madeline. She did in the session, and I remembered it. There's also another one that's kind of like, okay, so another breathing. I want you to really just, if you could right now, just take a deep breath. And as you're breathing in, imagine yourself getting ginormous. Like your person is just really getting really big. And then as you hit the top of the inhale, you snap back down with all your parts and just see if that kind of gives you some more presence with them right now. And that seems to really work too. Yeah.
I love that. I love using your breath
Yeah.
and focusing on self becoming bigger and more distinct with your breath.
Mhm. Yeah, I would have never thought to give it that label, but that's what it is. So probably anything under the genre of that is going to be good. So I love that. That's such a good naming of it, because I probably underneath that we could generate a list of a lot of different techniques that people can use when parts are storming.
Mm,
Um, yeah, I think
yeah,
that's really, really helpful.
that's good. We only have a few minutes left. What do you feel like you want the listeners to know about you, about your podcast, about what you
Yeah,
offer to the world?
yeah. So I'm gonna, can I give two just general things and then I'll do a little promotion? But I think there's two things. I think to all the clinicians listening to this, it's a deep, heartfelt request that we all really, I know all guides are important, but the more you can equip everyone you work with, your clients, to do work independent of sessions, that we really as a community should build a deep network and knowledge of people helping survivors specifically do work on their own, that there's not enough IFS therapists. The really good trauma informed ones are mostly out of pocket, myself included, and there's just not enough guidance to go around. And a few of us really need to be like, okay, given that context, how do we create frameworks for peer-to-peer support using IFS? How do we equip people to do real work, like organic unburdenings, day-to-day moments with parts? Like that is so important. And I know your book, your recent book, which I've read, congratulations on getting that out, is like one kind of effort towards that. Like you can each day think about working with your parts and how does it connect to recovery in real time. So I think that's my call to clinicians, given there are not enough trauma informed IFS practitioners accessible to everyone. I think to anyone who's listening that is a complex trauma survivor, that, it's really hard work to do this work and do it with a full commitment. It really takes you making your healing and making parts work a top 3 commitment in your life. Working kids and a partner probably come right up there too, but it needs to be on the level of this. So if you're listening and you're intrigued and you're interested, it absolutely will change your life. And it requires more than just a casual interest in it. Your whole life needs to be oriented around recovery to see the kind of gains that I'm talking about that I've experienced in my own life. So just kind of normalizing that as what it really takes to recover from complex trauma. It really is a brain injury in a lot of ways, and you don't heal a brain injury quickly. And I think then I just also want to say one other thing in closing is that I'm just so deeply appreciative to people like you, Tammy, and everyone in the IFS community that's been leading the way for, decades. And I know IFS right now is like really hip and cool and it's getting a lot of positive publicity. But I can imagine there were days, not so long ago where everyone thought you all were batshit crazy or, really belittled it. Like I know I spent time in a psych department. Like I know how clinical psychologists, the psychology as a discipline, the research world operates. And in the absence of evidence and the absence of a paradigm that makes sense to people, often ideas are rejected or ridiculed. And I just hold so much heartfelt appreciation for all of you that just kept walking and being like, I don't give a shit what other people say. This stuff works, because I'm sure it always hasn't been easy. Even, people that I love kind of are like, really? That's what you're doing now? Like, it seems a little strange or a little new agey or a little crazy or just kind of that instinctual, this doesn't jive with what I know about the world, and therefore it's easier for me just to reject it versus open up. I'm so thankful that all of you all kept walking, because in my community alone and in my own life, like when I say it's like I get emotional again. Like, it saved my life, it saved my children's life. The power of parts work for healing trauma, like literally can change an entire trajectory of an entire family with one human. And like that is priceless. So I just honor everyone who's laid the groundwork for me to enter into this world so seamlessly and be able to pick up and take what all of you all have done and just start learning, start growing, start finding my own way in it, and just building the network deeper in a very specific direction, big diagnosis, complex systems, but recognize that the community is what made that possible. So I just want to express that.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then how can people tell me about your podcast, and how can people just get in touch with you?
Yeah. So there's two of the best places. So my podcast is, I'm actually rebranding it. I'm doing this big, bold, true self move and renaming it my own name. So it's right now Relational Healing Podcast. It's soon to be rebranded as the Tanner Wallace Podcast, which feels really big and exciting and a little, but the two best places to find me are Instagram under the handle Dr. Tanner Wallace. And I have a website, therelationalhealinglab.com.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, Tanner, it was so good to talk to you. And
Yeah.
my system just feels, even though we've been talking about heavy, maybe sometimes scary things, my system feels so calm. I'm just noticing that. I'm just noticing a calmness.
Mhm.
And so I just want to thank you for coming on and for sharing your story and sharing your heart with
Yeah.
me and with the listeners.
Absolutely. Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for hanging out today. If you like this episode, make sure you subscribe. And if you really like this episode, share it with a friend and leave a review. You can follow me on Instagram at IFS Tammy and join our community on Facebook at the One Inside Podcast. Talk to you next time.